In the early phase of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler appeared to have discovered a way to defeat his enemies faster than anyone thought possible. German forces moved with a speed and coordination that stunned military observers across the world. Poland collapsed in a matter of weeks, followed by Denmark and Norway. Soon after, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France were overwhelmed with shocking efficiency. These victories created the illusion that Germany possessed a flawless method of war, one that combined tanks, aircraft, and infantry into a single unstoppable force. The concept of Blitzkrieg relied on movement, surprise, and psychological collapse. As long as opponents lost the will to resist quickly, the system worked. Hitler came to believe that boldness itself was a weapon and that hesitation was weakness. His confidence grew with every triumph, and his belief in his own strategic instinct hardened into certainty. Yet beneath these dramatic successes, Germany's strategy contained fatal weaknesses. It was built for short wars and limited objectives. It depended entirely on momentum and on enemies who could not adapt. It was never designed for long campaigns across vast distances or against opponents capable of replacing their losses and reorganizing their defenses. By 1941, Germany controlled most of continental Europe. Britain remained defiant but isolated, protected by the sea and its navy. Instead of focusing on defeating Britain through air and naval pressure or preparing for a defensive war against future enemies, Hitler made a decision that would change the course of the conflict. He ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation ever launched, involving millions of soldiers and thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union was a fragile structure that would collapse once struck hard enough. This belief was rooted not in careful military analysis, but in ideology. He viewed the Soviet state as weak, corrupt, and racially inferior, and he assumed its armies would disintegrate under pressure. At first, the invasion seemed to confirm his expectations. German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, capturing enormous territories and taking millions of prisoners. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, roads filled with burning vehicles and columns of defeated soldiers. Yet even as these victories accumulated, the German army was being stretched to its limits. Supply lines grew longer with every mile eastward. Trucks broke down, fuel became scarce, and spare parts were difficult to obtain. Railways had to be converted to German standards before they could be used. The vast distances of the Soviet Union absorbed German strength rather than collapsing under it. As summer turned to autumn, rain transformed roads into seas of mud. Vehicles sank into the ground, and movement slowed dramatically. When winter arrived, German soldiers found themselves without adequate clothing or shelter. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Frostbite became as deadly as enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, it mobilized its population and industry with brutal efficiency. Factories were dismantled and moved eastward beyond German reach. New armies were formed, often poorly equipped but numerically vast. Losses were replaced with new conscripts. The Red Army learned from defeat and adapted its tactics. The German army, designed for swift victories, found itself locked in a war of endurance that it was never meant to fight. Hitler refused to accept this reality. He increasingly distrusted his generals and believed that retreat was a sign of weakness. Orders were issued forbidding withdrawals, even when positions were hopeless. Strategy became rigid and centralized in Hitler's hands. Decisions that once belonged to experienced commanders were now dictated from headquarters based on maps and ideological conviction rather than battlefield conditions. This transformation reached its most catastrophic point at Stalingrad. In 1942, Hitler launched an offensive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, hoping to secure the fuel that Germany desperately needed. At the same time, he ordered the capture of Stalingrad, a city whose name carried symbolic value because it bore the name of the Soviet leader. These two objectives split German forces and weakened both efforts. Fighting in Stalingrad became a brutal struggle for factories, apartment blocks, and ruins. Progress was measured in meters. Casualties rose at a horrifying rate. Soviet forces prepared a massive counter-offensive on the weakly defended German flanks, which were held largely by Allied troops with inferior equipment. When the Soviet attack began, German armies were encircled. The Sixth Army was trapped inside the city. German commanders urged an immediate breakout, arguing that escape was still possible. Hitler refused. He ordered the army to hold its position and promised that it would be supplied by air. The promise was impossible to fulfill. Aircraft could not carry enough food, ammunition, and fuel to sustain an entire army under constant attack. Soldiers starved, froze, and fought without hope. In February 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. It was the first complete destruction of a German field army and a psychological shock to the entire nation. The myth of invincibility was broken, and the limits of Hitler's leadership were exposed for all to see. After Stalingrad, Germany attempted one last major offensive in the east at Kursk in the summer of 1943. New tanks and weapons were introduced in the hope of regaining the initiative. The plan was to encircle and destroy large Soviet forces in a single decisive battle. However, Soviet intelligence had learned of the attack in advance. Defenses were prepared in depth, with minefields, trenches, and anti-tank guns arranged in layers. When German forces attacked, they were slowed almost immediately. Tanks were destroyed in large numbers, and infantry advanced into walls of fire. Losses mounted while Soviet reserves remained strong. When the Red Army counterattacked, German forces were driven back from their starting positions. The battle marked the end of Germany's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations in the east. From this point onward, German armies would fight a continuous retreat, giving up territory while suffering irreplaceable losses in men and equipment. While Germany struggled in the east, the situation in the west also deteriorated. The United States entered the war and transformed it into an industrial struggle on a scale Germany could not match. American factories produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ships in numbers that overwhelmed German production. Bombing campaigns targeted German industry, transportation, and fuel supplies. Cities were destroyed, rail networks disrupted, and factories damaged. The war became a contest between economic systems as much as armies. By 1944, the Western Allies were ready to return to continental Europe. Hitler believed the main invasion would come at Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. As a result, he concentrated his strongest armored units there. Normandy was considered a secondary threat. When Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, German command was slow to react. Hitler delayed releasing armored reserves, believing the landings were a diversion. By the time German forces moved, the Allies had secured their beachheads and begun to expand inland. The breakout from Normandy led to the collapse of the German front in France and the liberation of Paris. Once again, Germany had lost the initiative. In the winter of 1944, Hitler launched one final offensive in the west, hoping to split Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. The attack in the Ardennes achieved surprise and initially pushed Allied lines backward. However, German forces lacked sufficient fuel, air support, and reserves to sustain the operation. The advance slowed, and Allied counterattacks regained lost ground. The offensive exhausted Germany's remaining strategic reserves and removed any realistic chance of reversing the course of the war. What remained was a defensive struggle against overwhelming force. By 1945, Germany faced destruction from both east and west. The Red Army advanced through Poland and into German territory, while Allied forces crossed the Rhine and moved toward the heart of the Reich. Cities lay in ruins, supply systems collapsed, and millions of civilians fled in fear. Hitler withdrew into his bunker in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed as effective formations. His strategy, once based on movement and initiative, had become a fantasy of resistance through sheer willpower. He believed that determination alone could overcome material reality. Yet war is decided by resources, adaptation, and the ability to learn from failure. Germany had lost the ability to control the direction and pace of the conflict. Every new operation was an attempt to regain something already lost. The early successes of Blitzkrieg had created an illusion of genius, but they were built on assumptions that proved false. Hitler believed enemies would collapse quickly, that speed could replace supply, and that ideology could overcome geography and industry. When these beliefs failed, the entire structure of his strategy collapsed. The moment Hitler's strategy began to collapse was not a single battle or a single decision. It was the moment when Germany lost the initiative and could no longer dictate the course of events. From that point forward, every victory was temporary and every defeat permanent. The war ceased to be about conquest and became a struggle for survival. The armies that once conquered Europe were destroyed in frozen fields, ruined cities, and endless retreats. Germany did not truly lose the war in 1945. It lost the war when its strategy stopped evolving and its leadership refused to adapt. What began as a campaign of domination ended as a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The collapse of Hitler's strategy was not sudden. It was slow, painful, and unavoidable. And once it began, no amount of courage, sacrifice, or technological brilliance could stop it. The moment his strategy began to collapse was the moment the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt, only the time it would take to reach its final conclusion.